thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know that this is a really busy time for you. So, how are things going?
Um, in an extreme fashion. I tend to take a good chunk of time off over summer, and since sort of the last week of my holidays always tends to be sort of emails plopping into my inbox saying, "What are you doing in September, October, and November?" And then it progressively ramps up towards Christmas to the point where November is an insanely busy month.
It is. November's always busy. It always startles me how everybody decides to do their events on the same day. They're crazy. So tell me, before we get started, in the introduction, we referred to you as an applied futurist.
Mm.
What's an applied futurist?
So it's a good question because I'm probably the only one you'll meet. And what it really means is that I do two things. Like most futurists or futurologists, the terms are kind of interchangeable. I help people to look at the future. And sometimes that's the near future. Clients come to me and say, what are the risks that might take us out at the knees in the next few years? Or what are the opportunities that we should be taking advantage of? And sometimes it's the far future. It's, what's the world going to look like in 20, 30 years' times? And that might be big corporations. I mostly work with sort of global 500s. It might be bits of government. And a huge variety of questions. Sometimes I'm talking about the future of snacks. I've been doing a lot of work with sort of Pepsi and Mars this year. Sometimes it's been transport. I've been working with Ford. A huge range of things. But then quite often when you've done that, when you've said what the future you think the future looks like, or helped them to imagine it for themselves, they come back with another question: is what do we do about it? And so the applied bit is I get involved in solutions as well as problems, and that particularly gets focused around organizations. How do we make organizations future ready, future proof? What can we do to improve resilience and agility and innovation?
And absolutely super important. I mean, goodness gracious, being future ready. I wish we had been more future ready in 2020, maybe. But that's another topic. Let's not go there. But what are the exciting projects that you've been working on this year?
So I mentioned Ford, and that was a great call to get. I'm a bit of a car nerd. I actually built my own electric car in lockdown with my daughter, and so that was actually that came out of a project, a car project with I was working on with Auto Trader on the future car. I was doing some research, came across this possibility of building your own EV, and so I thought I'd dig into the research in a lot more depth and actually do it. So that was fun, and that's led to lots of work in the automotive industry. I'd already worked with BMW and Audi, and so went to talk to Ford about the future of electric cars. That was really good fun, and I've sort of continued that theme, done quite a lot of work on where we're going with self-driving cars, etc. But then you're a complete sort of reversal of that, a completely different industry, because I do work across all different domains. Was getting phone calls from these big food companies, a variety of different food companies this year, who are really interested in what our changing lifestyles and life patterns are going to do to the food market, whether that's out of home, whether what our attitude is going to be to restaurants and takeaways and things like that, or actually what we're going to want to eat to suit working from home, working flexibly, working remotely. So completely different conversations about ingredients, the effects of climate change on different ingredients. Huge sort of broad range of inputs, and that's really what makes it so much fun, is that sort of ability to jump into different topics.
I love that. I love that. I've got to ask you, how long does it take to build an electric car?
Well, I thought it was going to take 6 months. It actually took 15 to get it MOT'd. So my daughter and I, well, both my daughters got kind of into cars during lockdown. We were watching lots of car content, and they asked if we could buy one of these beautiful 60s roadsters, and I don't have sort of £2.5 million spare. So I said no, but we could build one, and it sort of emerged from there. And 15 months later, we have a car, not pretty yet, but functional, on the road and MOT.
That is just brilliant. I love that. Absolutely brilliant. So I also love food. So I want to know what sort of things are you predicting then? How are we going to eat differently?
So one of my favorite food projects was around the future of pizza, which originally came out of a sort of STEM, sort of science, technology, engineering, and maths fair for children, and they wanted to talk about a topic that was going to be really relevant to children. And obviously, most kids love pizza, so they asked me what the future of pizza would look like. And this, you've got some core ingredients: you've got cheese, you've got tomatoes, and you've got the base, which is mostly made of flour. And so you look at things like climate change, which is quite possibly going to disrupt flour production. It's going to disrupt wheat growing. And you combine that with the fact that actually more and more people are going to sort of high protein diets and trying to cut out the carbs. We said, well, could we replace some of the wheat in the base with an alternative? And what we came up with was insect flour. And so you can actually grind up insects to make a completely, it's just slightly nutty, doesn't taste of anything odd, a sort of slightly nutty, high protein flour, which when mixed with wheat flour, increases reduces the carbs, increases the protein content, and might be an alternative to very expensive wheat flour.
Do we not need insects, though? Is that not going to be a concern? Are we not going to create another problem?
Well, absolutely. If you went around starting to sort of grind up bees, that would probably be an issue. But they're trying to find insects that can feed on waste and can actually sort of do two jobs, basically turn our waste into food. It's all a bit soil and cream, but yeah, it doesn't sound very appealing. But if you're looking for a good source of protein that's much more environmentally friendly than pork, beef, or even chicken, there might be one option. I'm not saying it's not without its issues. A lot of the insect farming at the moment isn't actually that environmentally friendly, but it's a possibility for the future.
Fascinating. And I love the fact that you brought up the environment, you've brought up climate change. I imagine that a lot of the future and what you're recommending with regards to being future ready takes that into account.
Huge. I mean, you cannot get away from the climate crisis. We've just had the report from the UN saying actually we're going to be really lucky to stay under 2.7 degrees of rise. And what I tend to get into is sort of the real impacts of that people haven't thought about. People are very sort of, they have this idea in the back of their head of melting icebergs and polar bears and all these things, but don't necessarily bring it back to the real world impacts for them and their business. So, what I was talking about with a client earlier, heat waves. A lot of our infrastructure isn't designed to cope with persistent heat, particularly in a place like the UK where we don't get an awful lot of persistent heat. And so actually, are we going to be facing more building damage or infrastructure damage that might disrupt transport, might increase maintenance bills, all sorts of things. Apart from the direct human cost of heat waves, there are things that people just haven't considered.
I hadn't considered any of those. That's really fascinating. So you obviously work on a really diverse range of projects. You're asked by lots of different industries to understand them and know them. How do you get to grips with all these industries?
It's funny because people have this idea that somehow I'm this fountain of all knowledge, and I have this. I spend all my time just absorbing and absorbing and absorbing, and I kind of do, but I only do it on a case by case basis. I look at what someone pays me to look at, and that sounds quite mercenary, but thankfully there are enough people paying me to look at interesting things to keep me interested. And what you do is you have to have is a framework, a pattern, a methodology that allows you to get to the important stuff fast. And this is the first thing I built when I started doing futurism full time. I've come from a background in the technology industry, originally an engineer, then running some various sort of digital businesses, and then a tech startup, and then came into futurism full time, having done it amateurly for a few years as a blogger and broadcaster. And the first thing I did was build my own toolkit. I said, how can I get into these topics quickly? How can I find answers for people to the questions they're really looking for? And it's exactly that. It's not about having a massive brain. It's not about knowing everything. It's just about being curious and having a process, a methodology that allows you to get to what's important fast.
Really important to have a process and methodology and a toolkit. That's very clever. So, I mean, you're underplaying your intelligence here. And now you've mentioned that you're an engineer. Of course, it makes sense that you would sort of be able to build an electric car. So it's all coming together. It's all making sense here. Excellent. So, in your last book, you talked about future proofing. It's called Future Proof Your Business. You talked about future proofing business. You talked about athletic organisations. You're not going to make us all go off and run marathons now, are you?
No, I probably ought to go and run a marathon. I think we all probably ought to run a little bit more. But no, it's this idea that if you're going to future proof your business, there's a number of characteristics you want it to have, a number of traits that it needs. And what I realized that those traits were quite well aligned with the traits of the greatest athletes. What do great athletes have that certainly I don't? And number one is they're in shape for the game they're playing. And I think the game of business has changed a lot over the last 20, 30 years, particularly driven by the introduction of digital technologies. And lots of companies just aren't in the right shape. They're literally not structured for these sort of waves of change that we're facing. And so I talk to organizations about how they change the structure, how they get in shape for the game they're playing. But then you've also got to see what's coming. Great athletes are really good at sensing what's going on. They have, the football brain of the greatest midfielders, or that sort of tactical, really strategic sense of great runners to know when to put that burst of speed on. And so you've got to have that ability to be connected to your market, but also to look forward. And it's something that staggers me is how bad most organizations are at thinking about the future. So I try and teach them about that, which is this sort of sense. And then the last thing is about decision making. You've got to great athletes. They see what's happening. They use that agility, that fitness that they've built up to make decisions fast and act on those decisions. And again, so many organizations, they might see what's coming, but they act so slowly. They take decisions so slowly that they respond too late. And so those three things, that the shape of the organization, the ability to sense what's coming, and the ability to respond at speed, those three critical athletic characteristics that I try and teach to my clients.
That really makes sense. It makes sense. By the way, I'm in shape. I'm just not sure what shape. So, especially after lockdowns and stuff, let's not go there. So, it's not just about companies, though, is it? You also offer advice for people on future-proofing their careers. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I've done. I always get asked the same questions, and this is kind of what this came out of. I do a lot of after dinner speaking as well as sort of the big, big conference events and go and do dinners and things. And the question that always came up in the more quieter Q&A afterwards was, what should I be teaching my kids, or what should I be doing for my career, in order to give them or me the best prospects? And so I got to thinking about this quite a lot. And then got involved in a project looking at the future of education, and these two questions came together: what should we be teaching and learning, and what should we be what should we be doing for our own futures? And we came up with this concept of the three C's, like these three critical skills for the future. And I think it's a great way of future-proofing your career by focusing on these three C's: the ability to curate, the ability to discover and qualify information, that ability to search through the morass, to penetrate the enormous cloud of dust of information that's out there now and find what's valuable and learn those research and qualification skills. The ability to create, the ability to synthesize something new, and fundamentally the core of so much of our value in the workplace, and I think broadly as human beings, the ability to make new things, the ability to create something. And so that creativity, those skills of iteration and recombination, I think are really important. And then lastly, communication. The last of the three C's. It's no good having these wonderful creations if you can't sell the ideas to your colleagues or your customers or your friends or your family. The actual ability to share your ideas, and sometimes that's going to be speaking, sometimes it's going to be writing, sometimes it's going to be design. It could be all sorts of different ways. Not everybody has to do it the same way. But I think by honing those three capabilities, the ability to discover and qualify information, the ability to create new things, the ability to communicate those ideas, you really do future-proof any career, whether you're talking to a child or an adult.
So the three R's are being replaced by the three C's then?
Very much so, very much so. I think, don't get me wrong, that the three R's are still important, but the direction of travel of education over the last sort of 10, 15 years has been very much a return to knowledge-based. Literally learning rote, lots of information about the world. And I just don't see the value of that in a world of search engines. I'd much rather somebody who could, great to have a few quiz answers, stuck in the back of your head and some knowledge with which to contextualize the world. But fundamentally, what I want is somebody who can use the tools of the world as it is to do great things.
I think there will be a lot of children, if there are any listening in, I hope they do, who will be absolutely applauding you and agreeing with you, because that whole learning by rote is just so dull, isn't it? Let's be honest.
My own children, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that, no, that's fantastic. And the future education is so important. Is education future ready? Are we creating the people that we need for the future, for what's happening? And I suppose there's a huge piece of education around the people who are educating so that they are ready. So I can see how you'd be very busy in that area.
Yeah, I think the disappointing thing is I think there are a lot of teachers are future ready or are ready to teach people for the future. They're just not necessarily operating in a framework that allows them to do so.
That's really disappointing, really disappointing. And actually, a question for you. Did you ever, when you were a youngster, when you were at school, did you ever imagine that you would become a futurist?
So I always, it's in 1981, and this, we'll come back to this story. We can't come back to this story in this podcast, but in a future one, if I come back on it, we'll come back to the story. But in 1981, my mum bought me, and I'm waving it to you now, although maybe the audience can't see this, the Usborne Book of the Future. And it has been a sort of Bible for me ever since. And it really did. It showed me the idea that actually there are people who get paid to think about the future. And so, it was about 15 years ago, I started a blog called The Book of the Future, which was really my entry point into futurism. And around the same time, got asked to go on the BBC to explain a few things that a DJ understood I knew about, and the two kind of came together eventually. That what had really been a passion from the age of 3 about thinking about the future, to turn into a career back in about 2012.
Well done, Mum. How good is that? Another futurist there. Well done, Mum. Brilliant. I like that. So here's a big question for you. Maybe it's a bit unfair, but hey, why not? You know, you're a futurist. We want to know, what's your big prediction for the future that we should all be looking out for?
So the one that's really hot at the moment, and I think is very, very widely misunderstood, is the metaverse. There's a lot of conversation around it at the moment because Facebook is apparently pivoting to become a metaverse company. And people have this idea that it's really virtual reality, that we're all just going to be putting these giant headsets on and leaving the physical world behind, and just never seeing another human being again, and just existing in a world of virtual avatars. And that's not the case at all. That maybe where the metaverse started. It started in science fiction in a book called Snow Crash, as exactly that. But these days, the people actually building the metaverse are really thinking about it as the integration of the physical world and the digital world. Right now, the two are separated by that sheet of glass on the front of your phone. That you're never actually in the digital world because it's inside your device. Whereas as we shift from handsets to headsets, and we start to project the digital world on top of the physical world, so you can see a virtual person and they could look as real as the physical person walking down the street, or it could be a robot or an alien or anything you like, and you start to interact with them as humans have interacted with each other for hundreds of thousands of years. Suddenly those digital and physical worlds blend, and I think that's a really both terrifying prospect in terms of what it means for us as a species, but also what it means for business, retail, what it means for interpersonal communication, what it means for dating. It touches every aspect of our lives. And I think people right now are dismissing it as some dodgy idea by a bunch of Silicon Valley billionaires. And actually, I think it's going to be truly transformative.
Wow. How far in the future is that, would you say?
It's a bit like nuclear fusion. I think I've probably been saying it's 10 years away for about the last 10 years.
Okay.
But I mean, I think we're probably less than 5 years from having the first serious mixed reality headsets that you might walk down the street in and not look a total fool. And 10 years from it being mainstream. It's a bit like the smartphone. You could get a smartphone in 2002. I had one, and all my friends laughed at it because it was a giant brick. But no one really took them up until Apple got involved in 2007. And I think the same thing will happen with the metaverse. There'll be weirdos like me walking down the road in slightly odd looking glasses in a few years' time, but it won't go truly mainstream until a few years after that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Wow, you've given us so much great value today. I really, really appreciate it. Is there a thought you would like to leave our listeners with about the future?
My main one is to think about it more. Like, we're all futurists. Like, everybody who's ever bought insurance, planned a holiday, ironed a shirt for the day ahead. Like, you're thinking about the future, but we don't do it in a very structured fashion. And what I try and encourage all my clients to do is to carve out 1% of their time as an individual or at work to focus on the future, which is only one day every 6 months. Can you find one day every 6 months to focus on the future and do it in a structured way? Break out of the day-to-day, just go and look at what's happening in adjacent markets, or what other people are doing, or what's happening abroad is always really interesting. Go and look at China or South Korea or parts of Africa, always interesting things happening. And see what you can learn. But just carve out that time. Give yourself a chance, 1% of your time focused on the future.
I think one day every 6 months is incredibly doable, really, isn't it? When you put it that way, stick it in your diary and make it happen.
You'd really hope so. And yet, so few of us do.
Okay, I'm going to put it in when we sign off. I'm going to put a day in my diary every 6 months to think about the future, get my crystal ball out and look at what could be. Tom, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. It's whizzed by.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Maria.
Wonderful. And thank you all for listening to The Speaker Show. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to Apple Podcasts and give it a rating. Keep up with future episodes at the Speakers Associates website, which is speakersassociates.com, or your favourite podcast app, of course. And if you would like Tom to come into your organisation and help you to be future ready, please contact Speakers Associates in very good time, because you've heard it here. He's super busy. Thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye for now.